welcome to Out of the Box Radio with me, your host, Christine Blasdale. Out of the Box Radio is a weekly podcast of audible ear candy dedicated to bringing a fresh perspective on this thing that we call life. And each and every week, we're going to be diving into the topics that matter most with lively conversations on issues such as health, wellness, and transformational healing, all with the goal of creating a better world and becoming a happier human being. I will be your tour guide for this epic adventure, and each and every week we're going to be embarking on a journey with the ultimate goal being transformation to our highest potential. And now, let's get out of the box. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Out of the Box with Christine. I am your host, Christine Blasdale, and I'm very, very happy that you joined the program today because we have a very exciting program. Why? Well, have you ever wondered about the people who actually really control the world? Have you ever thought about that? My guest this hour knows a little bit about those people because he has not only studied this phenomenon, but has just written a brand new book called Giants, the Global Power Elite. His name is Peter Phillips. He was the former director of Project Censored and Media Freedom Foundation, and he is also professor of political sociology at Sonoma State University. And a long time, oh my goodness, Peter, I've known of your work for many, many years, and I respect the work that you do for so many years. And I think it's been a long time since I've spoken to you. So welcome to the show, and I'm just so glad that of the work that you've been doing and this current work that you're doing right now on this book, Giants, the Global Power Elite. Welcome to Out of the Box.
Christine, thanks for having me on. It's exciting to do this. This new book is just coming out, and this is actually the first radio opportunity I've had to talk about it. So it's really not officially out for 3 more weeks.
Well, and your subject matter, I'm guessing after flipping through the book and realizing that a lot of the media corporations that would be doing any kind of reviews of this or interviews, there's a few of those large media corporations that are probably wouldn't be so excited about getting this information out. But just for our listeners, to give them a little bit of a background, I would love if you could just tell folks about the work that you've done prior. In particular, I really appreciate the work you've done with Project Censored and covering the most important news stories that the mainstream media hasn't covered. Can you talk a little bit about your work from Project Censored days?
Well, I inherited the project from Dr. Carl Jensen in 1996 and I was director for 14 years, and in that time put out 14 annual censored books, which, circulate around the world, are still online, and they covered the most important news stories the corporate media didn't cover. And so every year, hundreds of students and faculty from various campuses all over the country would nominate stories, and then we would vote collectively and select the top 25 that we thought were the most important. And that's just a boilerplate thing that we've been doing. And we have a new book coming out, Censored 2019, which will be like our 25th or 27th book. And the project's been around for over 40 years, since 1976. So it's a long time media analysis critical media project that talks about how we don't get the whole story.
It's so absolutely valuable in these times, and it's been for so many years such an important publication, and I'm just so grateful, like I said, to the work that you've done on that over the years. And now, when we talk about media analysis, let's let our listeners. A lot of people are in a very short attention span mode. There is this thing called the social media. Everybody's on social media, so it's a very quick attention span that folks have. But let's talk about media analysis. If you do listen to anything or see anything on even on your social media, there is this conversation or argument, right, that there is fake news. There is also those that say the liberal media, and I would just like to get your analysis of the corporate media. Now, we're not talking about wonderful progressive radio stations or, of course, individual podcasters and things like that. But we're talking about, the ABC, NBC, CNN, Fox, all those. Let's talk about that narrative of course, the narrative fake news and the liberal media.
Well, in one sense, all news is essentially fake.
Yes.
It really is. 80% of what we get on television news has been prepackaged or spun by a public relations firm. And it was Ben Bagdickian gave me that statistic almost 20 years ago, and it's been verified in a number of other studies that these big PR firms, Omnicom, WPP, Interpublic Group, they basically manage the news for the world. And they're doing it for profit. They're doing it for corporations, and they work for various, private companies, but they also work for governments. So they can manage the news. WPP can manage the news, the Central Intelligence Agency, or the State Department. And so they're packaging news stories that have an agenda. What Noam Chomsky and Ed Herman called the propaganda model over 25 years ago when they wrote their book on that, and it's biased. So there's very little other than your local news stories and your auto wrecks and murders that you can trust on corporate media today. It's mostly misinformation or partial information and bias.
And nothing proves that better than when there's a ramp up to war. And as you've covered, for many years, when there is a ramp up for war, there are certain industries, companies, people that make a killing off of killing. And so we witnessed it with the ramp up before the Iraq War, the war in Afghanistan. They were, every day you would turn on the television, it would be these generals talking, right? And the generals happened to be on the board of some, Lockheed Martin or some, weapons manufacturer. Later on, you find that out. But it's obviously there is a collusion going on, and a lot of Americans I think they're not aware of it. But as you were saying, it's 80% of news is some type of PR spin?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, right.
Wow.
It's right in that range. And so we call public relations firms public relations and propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
Because essentially there's no difference between, propaganda per se and public relations. They're all spinning a story or spinning an idea for profit and benefit. And, that's or political perspectives.
Exactly.
So that's a really important piece of understanding my book, Giants, the Global Power Elite, because corporate media is protecting the wealthy. They protect the global 1%, which of course the Occupy movement gave us that mantra, 99 versus 1%. And that was certainly a very important understanding. People get that. The 1%, people with assets over 700,000. And there's 35 millionaires in that. And then we know about the 2,000 plus billionaires in the world from Fortune magazine. But what we don't know, and what my book openly addresses, is who are the core people in this 1% that set the policy and direction for protecting capital, global capital growth, and debt collection. These are a very small number of people, and I identify 389 people in the book by name, what corporations they're affiliated, what policy councils they're in, and their public net worth. So I looked up each of those in the companies that they're in and found out their stock holdings and that. So it's a very data-centered book, but it lays out a sociology of power and a sociology of the 1% that we haven't seen before. There's been good theory books on it, good writings about it, but this is concrete evidence that there's this core of people that control the world's wealth. And let me put it really straightforwardly. There's 17 companies that I call the giants. These are money management firms like Blackrock and Chase Manhattan Bank and Prudential that have over $1 trillion in money that they manage. So we're not talking billions here. We're talking trillions. And these 17 companies have $41 trillion collectively that they control. So it's BlackRock and Vanguard and JP Morgan Chase and UBS and Bank of America and Barclays, State Street, Fidelity, the Bank of New York Mellon, and many others, Prudential, Morgan Stanley, and foreign ones as well, French and German. These 17 asset management firms in 2017 controlled $41 trillion worth of wealth. What's amazing about this is that their board of directors, and I looked up every single one of them, and there's only 199 people. So these 199 people are making the decisions of investments for now it's close to $50 trillion worth of wealth in the world. Now, so when we say wealth, I mean, a company has wealth and owns assets and it may have factories and things like that, but this is cash. So it's the whole wealth of the world is like $250 trillion. But when it comes right down to cash, this is a control of majority of the cash in the world by just a few hundred people. It's very concentrated, very controlled. That's not all their money. So they got 35 millionaires. They give their money to BlackRock to invest somewhere. But the people who run BlackRock are the ones making the decisions where to invest that money. And one of the problems they have, this concentration of capital wealth, the problem they have is they have more money than they've got good places to invest in. So they have surplus capital, and they need to find places to put that. And so that's what led to the subprime mortgage breakdown in 2008. They were investing in it, knowing that those were risky investments, but they had no other place to do it. And so they practically lost it. I mean, they admitted that they, almost lost the whole shebang worldwide in terms of capital. It could have collapsed completely. They think they've tried to fix that now, but they haven't. So there's things that happen. They have this surplus capital. There's two ways that they help, that the government helps them spend it. One is wars.
Yeah.
So permanent war allows for blowing up of things, expending money. Governments, reinvest, and these private companies, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, are all heavily invested in by these giant companies. I mean, BlackRock alone has like 20 billion invested in those three companies, and those are the, making war as a way of using up surplus capital that returns a profit to the capitalists. The other way is buying up public resources. So, the push to, privatize everything, whether it's public education or prisons or, buying up water rights, everything is commodified. So we're privatizing the world, so to speak, and it creates a conflict of continued concentration of capital that's protected by every government that's involved in capitalism in the world.
Well, yeah, and then with the looking at the prisons, when you privatize prisons, and you're looking at a profit model, then you're going to be trying to fill up those prisons as much as possible. What's weird is the taxpayer. There's a bleed in there with the taxpayer when the U.S. government declares war, and they go to war with whatever country they choose of the country of the week, whatever one they want to go and invade through some campaign that they say, that they're holding weapons of mass destruction or this or that, right? Whatever the PR is going to be spinning. When the U.S. goes to war, Peter, does the U.S. government or the institution known as the U.S., does it borrow money from banks in order to fund that war?
Well, yeah, sometimes, or the banks just create money. The
It's right.
investment they buy, they, the Federal Reserve just can create money, but they buy stocks in these companies, and then the government is buying airplanes and tanks and bombs and weapons from private companies. So yes, that's why our budget for the military is so high in the U.S. It's close to $1 trillion when you count the veterans benefits and things like that. So it's the biggest part of all the money, all the taxes that we have, well over half. And we spend more on the military than the rest of the world combined. So it is a big supporter of privatized capital and profit making that supports not only the giant investment companies, but the armaments industry as well. And they're all interconnected, which I think my book is amazing in that capacity, and no one else has ever done this. Those 17 giants are all invested in each other. So there's one, I have this map of the 17 giants and the little lines between their co-investments. They have over 400 billion invested in each other. So Bank of America or Goldman Sachs or Barclays or Allianz or Prudential, Morgan Stanley, they're all invested in each other. So there's this big cluster of capital investment, 50 trillion plus, controlled by a few hundred people. And when I say cluster, it's a cluster because they're all in the same business, interconnected with each other in terms of billions of dollars, sucking up any surplus capital in the world. So it makes the idea of a cluster suck sound pretty appropriate.
Yes, it does.
And then that was in 2017. In 2018, there were 3 new companies, Wilmington, Northern Trust, and BNP, that became trillion-dollar investment companies. And then there's another 8 that are almost giants. They're 800 billion plus, and they're all interinvested with each other.
Ugh.
It's just
like a hydra.
Sociologically, it's just an amazing cluster of folks that are, there's 199 what I call the power elite managers of global capital, and they're 70% male, 84% white of European descent, 59 MBAs, 22 JDs, 23 PhDs. They're all highly educated. They all came from elite colleges, with 10% of them coming from Harvard or Stanford. And they're 117 are from the United States, 59%. 22 each from Britain and France, 13 each from Germany and Switzerland, and then Italy, Singapore, India, Austria all have several. Japan, Brazil, South Africa, the whole world is represented there, at least the whole capitalist world. So any country that has resisted capital investment, and that was all the countries where we've seen regime changes for supposedly humanitarian reasons, which is a lie, or the weapons of mass destruction. These were dictatorships that were using their capital gains to benefit their own people. Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein, and in Syria as well. The government was in fact helping the people there. If you're a dictator, you're exploiting your people and you're allowing capital to be invested and exploited, nobody's going to bother you.
Right.
But if you're a dictator that interferes with capital flow, capital investment in your own country, that's where a regime change needs to happen. And policies get established through policy groups to make those recommendations, and governments and intelligence agencies implement them.
You had mentioned in the beginning too, one of the largest of these elites, I guess the elite financial sector here, a company called Blackrock. This is a name that I would say, if you asked anybody on the street, do you know who or what Blackrock is, they couldn't tell you. And can you tell us how much wealth that BlackRock has as far as capital investment, and
Well, in
who's at the
seven,
helm of that? Who's running BlackRock?
a guy named Larry Fink from L.A. is the manager, and he's got quite a history. But um, they had in 17 they had 5.4 billion. I understand it's up over trillion. It's up over 6 trillion now. And what they're particularly known for is their investment research in advance. So they have a couple thousand analysts that will look at all kinds of different investment possibilities and what they can do with it. So Larry Fink, he was from Los Angeles. He is 66 this year. He came from a middle-class Jewish family in Van Nuys. UCLA BA, MBA from UCLA Anderson Graduate School of Management. And in 1976, he was hired at First Boston in their bond market. Next several years, he added over $1 billion he was one of their stars until he made a mistake and he lost a couple $100 million and they let him go. So he's deciding what to do. And one of the people that he knew was he goes to work for Blackstone Group, and he's involved there. And they set him up to develop BlackRock. They advanced him money, and then he uses this derivatives and assess liabilities network called Aladdin, which employs some 2,300 analysts to market test all the financial markets in the world. So he would be able to produce better returns than any other investment company. And that's what built him up. I mean, that's where Obama kept his money, probably still does. So, Larry Fink, he married his high school sweetheart. He's got 3 kids. He's got a Upper East Side apartment, a 26-acre farm in North Salem, and a house in Aspen. And he's worth about $400 or $500 billion today.
Phew. Wow. And you name some other you name some power players that people are a little bit familiar with in the book. And folks, if you're just tuning in, my name is Christine Blasdale. You're listening to Out of the Box with Christine, and my guest is Peter Phillips. He is the author of the brand new book Giants: The Global Power Elite. And in the book, you also mentioned such familiar names as Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Jamie Dimon, who I don't know if people are familiar with Jamie, and, of course, Warren Buffett. Let's just go through some of these more famous folks.
I name these people because they're famous, and they're listed as, in Forbes. They're one of the 2,000 billionaires, and Jeff Bezos now apparently is the largest with $150 billion. But these are individuals. They don't act in unison. There's not a sociology of billionaires. Some of them do, but for the most part, they're incredibly rich people. They're primarily oriented towards making more money, and they're not what I call part of the power elite network. The power elite network is people who are engaged in making policy recommendations to continue to allow capital to grow and expand worldwide and to protect it. So the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, all of those transnational government organizations, the International Bank of Settlements, each of those are kind of run by governments, or there's a percentage base. The more money you put in, the more power you get, but they're still under control of governments. My book analyzes how these elites, or what we call part of the transnational capitalist class, the upper 1%, or the 1,000th of 1% in actuality, how these people sociologically interact. And they do this through a number of organizations. The most important one is called the Council of 30. And that's based in Washington, D.C. It's Rockefeller funded, and it has most of the major central bankers from around the world. There's 32 people, 31 are men, there's one woman, and they're part of they set the recommendations and an agenda for the World Bank, for the International Monetary Fund. I mean, they're the ones, their policy recommendations, they're like the central directors of global capitalism. And it's a very small number of 30 people.
That's crazy.
Diamond is not part of that. Either is Fink. They may know them, they may interact with them, but that council is in particularly very important. The other one is the Trilateral Commission, which is international with some 400 members, but they have an executive committee of about 50 folks. And these are the people that identify them by name, by positions, by net assets, and their policy kinds of points and who they're involved with. And so you have the Trilateral Commission and this Council of 30 are the two primary non-governmental corporate elite policy recommendation groups that literally manage and give instructions to the transnational banks and the policies globally. So like the Trilateral Commission, well, they'll put out reports. One of the reports they put out 6 years ago was the need to go back to containment with Russia. And they blamed Putin for what they called the invasion of the Crimea.
Yes, right.
And there was no invasion. They already had bases there. 90% of the people in that region voted to separate from Ukraine and go with Russia. Russia had their bases. The U.S. CIA knew that Russia would not let go of that. But it allowed for them to start to negate Russia, to bring back the
Cold War.
The Cold War. And, but that was a policy recommendation from the Trilateral Commission 6 years ago. So you see the direction and the changes that occur. They do reports on Korea. They do reports on Afghanistan. All of that is the policy recommendations that end up worldwide advisement, and the intelligence agencies pay attention to that. It's called protecting our vital interests, which is very much part of protecting global capital.
Which is
exactly what it is.
And it's under the guise of national security at that point.
It's under the guise of national security, but it's under the guise of national security in France and Germany, and everywhere else that's capitalist. And they interact with each other and they cooperate. These governments do to protect global capitalism. That's the number one priority. That's the most important thing that governments are doing. That's the most important thing that Trump has done. Presidents are functionaries. Trump is a functionary that, he lowered taxes on corporations. They allowed the bank rules that Obama had put in after the collapse in 2008 to be readjusted so banks can further their growth and expansion. He's been giving the elites exactly what they want. They don't care about, how rude he is and that kind of stuff. It's as long as he's benefiting the central core of capitalism, they're going to keep him.
Right.
And it's Democrats and Republicans both.
Exactly. That's something that I think a lot of people miss out on. And I, even with wonderful, very well-educated progressive folks that I know and love, they still have this thing. It's this us against them. It's this blue versus red. The Democrats are better than the Republicans, and then my, some friends that are Republicans say that Republicans are better than, and I'm trying to tell them it's two wings of the same bird.
It's exactly two wings of the same bird, and Trump he's the pilot right now flying, which Jamie Dimon actually said, well, yeah, he's the pilot flying our airplanes, so we got to support him. Even though the Trump advisory board, his Wall Street advisory board, broke down last summer, particularly after he was making comments about all the race stuff that was going on. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean they don't support the capital growth that he's bringing about. Right. So until Trump does something that really impacts profits and central capitalism, they're not going to get rid of him. And nobody in Congress is going to make moves to impeach him for a variety of reasons. And we can clamor and claim and call him all the names we want. That just keeps us busy focusing on one guy, when in fact we need to be focusing on global capitalism.
Right.
Concentrated wealth. And these 389 people I name in the book, I mean, these are the people that control the world. And they impact all of our lives, whether it's interest rates or taxes, everything. Not only here, but around the world in the wars. I mean, we've got troops, special operation forces in 150 nations in the world. That's not to protect us. That's to protect capitalism, to protect investments, to protect wealth. And that's the name of the game worldwide.
And it's such a game of like the Wizard of Oz, like pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. The front man, whoever the front man or front woman is, they may take the heat for a little bit, but it's a short time for that heat and all of the deals that are being worked in the background. Again, like you said, has nothing to do with a political party's affiliation at all. I was wondering too, like right now, what the chatter is. Obviously, you can't turn on the radio or television without this whole thing about Russia. What's going on, Peter? What is this again? Kind of like a whipping up of the Cold War about Russia meddling in our. When they talk about Russia meddling in our elections, I always laugh because I know how our intelligence agencies meddle not only meddle in other countries' politics, but I mean they've taken out democratically elected leaders, like taking them out. But what do you think what's going on? Because it's not about Russia and some type of getting into a server or database or changing the election. But what do you think it is?
It's investment capital wanting to get into Russia.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, exclusively. It's all about, Putin has reestablished Russian control. Yeltsin let in all the big investors and all of that. But Russia is an incredibly vast resource of oil, minerals, wealth for investment.
Natural gas, too. Right.
Natural gas. And the global elites, they want access to that. They want to be able to invest there. As long as the government keeps the population under control, they're going to put billions into there if they can. And that's the agenda. The agenda is regime change. And the Trilateral Commission, it was the Atlantic Council, which is the other big policy group, which is a NATO advisory board, but it's now become a kind of a global military advisory group. The Atlantic Council made recommendations that there be regime change in Russia. Now, Putin knows that. He's totally aware of that. He knows that he's being undermined and repressed. Yet, it's been very successful here in this country, blaming Putin, blaming Russia for supposedly even getting Trump in, trying to make that statement. There's no evidence that the Russian government had anything to do with that. Or if there is, they certainly haven't released it yet. It's not a priority. They want to have open capital investment everywhere in the world. And the countries that are resisting that are still independently controlled are China and Russia in particular, and Cuba, of course, and North Korea. But that's not the agenda to try to get along. The agenda is to undermine that and get capital penetration everywhere in the world.
Exactly. I was going to say the globe, 15 years ago, it looked quite different. There wasn't the taking over, the absolute destruction, and we're talking about also lives here. We're talking about millions of people being affected, killed or injured. But with Iraq, with Afghanistan, and we know the wealth of resources Afghanistan had. But under the Taliban, of course, there was also like a little bit of, well, somewhat of control on certain things. I know the poppy fields were being eradicated at that point, which is the heroin market, right? Which is the street heroin, I guess. But of all those, and I don't know if this was the PNAC, the Project for New American Century, in their in their manifesto of the countries that needed a regime change, was I know Iraq, Afghanistan, I believe it was Libya, Somalia. So all of the checklist is pretty much almost done. They've accomplished a lot, and they've accomplished that in a very short amount of time. What is remaining is still with Syria is still holding out, right? I mean, it hasn't been full, but
Syria's holding out, even though we have
they've been
cases
pummeled
legally in Syria. But the Russians basically bailed out the Syrians and protected them.
And then there's North Korea, right?
We were ready to start a no-fly zone there.
And in North Korea, and look how close we got to some. I mean, it was getting very strange, the conversations going on between North Korea and the president, even just the tweets and everything. But so North Korea still has not been completely taken over, capitalized, right?
And they have to resist populist movements like in Venezuela, where Maduro just got some 60% of the vote to continue, and the U.S. media calls him a dictator and, a hardliner and all that kind of stuff, and it's ridiculous.
They did that with Chavez, too.
They did that with Chavez. Yes, definitely. They helped lead a coup there.
And then we have Iran, right?
Iran is independent and separate, very much so, and we're doing everything we can, certainly encouraged by Israel, to try to, have a regime change or even go to war with Iran. So these are dangerous, saber-rattling activities worldwide. And at the same time, if we look at this, as wealth is concentrated, as these billionaires get wealthier, as the global giants pack more money into their management systems, and the elites are making governments to allow that to happen, 80% of the world lives on $10 a day, and half of the world lives on $3 a day or less. And 30,000 people die every day from malnutrition and easily curable diseases. That's a slaughter.
Yes.
That's an abomination. And that's going on every day. It's, 9/11 killed 3,000 people. Well, 30,000 a day are dying worldwide. And we don't get. That's the crisis, the humanitarian crisis of the world. Throw pollution on top of that.
Yes.
And, this isn't going to work. We can't continue to concentrate capital. That's the message of my book to the elites. Okay, you guys, you can't continue to do this. Your grandchildren won't have a world to live in.
What people also have to realize too, when there is a takeover of a country and meaning all of their resources, then there is a clampdown on people as well. They'll either take over all the water resources and then jack up the price on it. They'll price gouge on it, so they're not able to. It's cheaper for them to have a Coca-Cola, and that's what they sell, for cheap, than to have a glass of water. There is a country, and I can't remember it right now, where once, I don't know if it, and I don't want to mix the stories up, but I'm not certain if it was once the World Bank got in there, or one of those large financial institutions that come over and they basically take over the whole country, or they loan the money to the quote-unquote leader. There is one country where they were trying to make it illegal to capture rainwater. Bolivia. Talk about Bolivia, because that...
And the privatization of water.
The privatization of water.
This is when you start to privatize everything. Imagine that you're driving a solar car and then you have to go and pay a tax for using the sunshine. or that you can go into the mountains and there's a spring coming out of the ground, but it's privately owned and you can't drink it. I mean, that's the direction we're heading, is the complete privatization of the world and all the resources and complete control. I mean, we can call it fascism, but it's going back to a state of feudalism where the royalty are, in fact, the corporate owners, the means of production at the corporate level and the bank and investment level. And we're the serfs with zero power. And even if they let us vote occasionally, it's still not any kind of a democracy where our say has any play whatsoever. That's the direction we're headed. And it's very scary. It's very terrifying to think about that. And unless they can change this, and they say, oh, we just have to keep growing, we'll grow out of this problem, and it'll trickle down to the poor. It doesn't trickle down.
It never trickles down.
And what trickles? I mean, there needs to be a river of capital that flows down to everyone in the world in order to keep the world sustainable and surviving. If not, we're really faced with, people are going to be faced with food riots and starvation, and there'll be massive civil unrest, and even these elites have private military that they can hire. So the second largest employer in the world is G4S out of Great Britain. They employ 650,000 people worldwide, and their security. They run security for banks. They do prisons. They have private mercenaries. They can put armed forces in the field to kill people. So we have these private armies, private military contractors that corporations can just hire, and they can build their own green zones to protect their elites, and the rest of us will be outside getting by on basically nothing, or a very polluted environment.
And of course, with private armies, you have there is no law. They're not held accountable. As you would, I don't want to talk about the military because there's a lot that are in the official military, our official armies that are not also held accountable for what's going on. But with these private armies, again, and security firms, there was a name that made quite a bit of money, and had a lot of contracts. Blackwater, I believe, right? And Blackwater had not such a great history of stuff that they were involved in either, or DynCorp, which I believe Cynthia McKinney actually had spoken about DynCorp and some of the nefarious things that they were up to as well.
Blackwater is now called Academy.
What's it called?
It's called Academy.
Wow, they changed their name.
Yeah, and they merged with several other companies, so they're really huge.
Ugh.
They have a big training field in North Carolina. But they have their own Air Force now. I mean, it's the Secretary of Education, Dubois, that's her husband. I mean, her brother is the head of Blackwater.
Oh, DeVos. Is it DeVos?
Yes.
Her brother is the head of Blackwater?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Oh, God. Oh. And now on top of it, what is really so diabolical about this whole thing is that the vulture mentality, because and what it is that it's always the people, the poor people, who are the victims of the wars, right? They get the bombs dropped on them. They get the environmental devastation from all of the military, the uranium, the quote unquote depleted uranium, which there's no such thing as depleted uranium. It's uranium, it's radiation. But then on top of it, they have to pay for it. They have to pay for the cleanup, so to speak. And it's either through the United States with the tax system, and so many Americans they're in la la land. They don't understand what they're actually paying for when they do pay their taxes. But then there's also those whole countries that are affected by these. It was with Greece, right? Wasn't there a bailout with Greece, and there was austerity measures, and they're still hurting. From my understanding, the entire country of Greece is still devastated by that.
Yes.
And who's
that comes down from the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund, or even the banks that are loaning money to governments globally, demand austerity, meaning they can't spend money on their own people. That's what it means. Plus, they ask for privatization so that assets of the community become privatized, become corporately owned. So you may have gone to a park that you enjoyed as a child, and now you have to pay a fee, and it's owned by a corporation. I mean, that's the direction that all of this is going. They have surplus money. They don't know what to do with it. So they want to buy things up. They want to privatize so they can get a return on it, so that capitalism continue to grow and get returns. It can't do that indefinitely. That's the contradiction. Sooner or later, it will collapse. And that collapse could be really nasty for the world, with civil unrest and wars and environmental destruction and a total global war. And that would be catastrophic. So my book is aiming to convince these elites, who we name, that they've got to do something about this now, to change the direction now, that it has to happen, so that at least if you look at this book, Giants of Global Power Elite, you can see who these people are that are making these decisions, and that they're named. You can write them letters at their corporation. Social movements of any kind can benefit from knowing who the people are that are pulling the purse strings of the world. And, we need to reestablish the importance of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. If we go back, you look at that document, which was written over 70 years ago, approved by the United Nations as a moral document for what the rights of human beings are. And Article 25 clearly says that people have a right to housing, to employment, to adequate nutrition. I mean, these are human rights. And, we're violating that. And any social movement, any government, any progressives that want to make change in the world are going to need to find a standardized moral code. And there's nothing better than the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
I love that.
Even people take out the pronouns where it says man and put in people, things like that. It doesn't matter. I mean, because back then, Eleanor Roosevelt, her argument was man meant both men and women. Well, yeah, it did then.
Right.
But
right.
It doesn't anymore. So it's still the principles are the same. People have rights to leisure. They have, rights to their own determination. They have rights to nationhood and citizenship. All of those are being violated every day around the world. And they have, to travel. It's just, if we can stand on what those human rights are in terms of a moral code, that's the direction we need to go. And it's not being taught in public school. I teach it in every class I have, but it's not being taught openly in public schools, and it needs to be.
Oh, amen. This is something. You know what? I will personally. I'm so happy that you mentioned that, because I will personally actually look this up and then and get this out to friends and family as well, and encourage them to get it out, because we're being trained. We're being trained to have less and less and less money, work harder, less freedom, less rights, less everything. And we're being trained like that frog in the pot, and you slowly, you just kind of keep the water getting a little warmer, and eventually we'll wake up and have absolutely no rights to anything, even our own bodies. And I think this is extremely important. So I'm going to, that'll be my personal, my personal crusade to get out to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and get that out to friends and listeners as well. Peter,
it gives us a standard, whatever social movement you're in or whatever activism you're engaged in. This is a standard document that we can all agree on.
Right. It doesn't matter if you're Republican or Democrat or purple.
Absolutely.
Okay. So what, in addition to being aware of those rights and what we deserve and what we need to work for, what are some things, let's talk about solution-oriented. What are some things that we can do as a collective, as maybe as as a country, as citizens, but what about also individually? What can people do other than also picking up your book, which we want people to do? Giants: The Global Power Elite by Peter Phillips. What can people do, Peter?
Well, the resistance movements are everywhere in the world. Resisting various aspects of repression. All of them together collectively could change stuff. But we don't try to have a prescription in the book of giants. We just want to name who the ones are that are in charge. And so the letter that we send to them, that's in the postscript of that, we said, we list some 389 of you by name in this book. You should be honored and proud of your station in the global power structure, meaning that you're in the book, you're a key part of managing, supporting, protecting major portion of the world's wealth. And you're part of the groups I talked about, the 30 Trilateral Commission, Atlantic Council. And we don't have a prescription for changing the world. We think that addressing the world's needs in the framework of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is the right place to start. We absolutely believe that continued capital concentration and neoliberal austerity policies only bring greater human misery to the vast majority of people on Earth. And wars, regime changes, propaganda, media, technological surveillance, all in the name of protecting the freedom to do business, has to be stopped. Mm-hmm. And you have to think of that in terms of your grandchildren and their grandchildren, and making decisions on the use of the world resources. So it's no longer acceptable for you to believe that you can manage capitalism to grow its way out of the gross inequalities we all face. The environment cannot accept more pollution and waste, and civil unrest everywhere is inevitable at some point. Humanity needs you to step up and ensure the trickle-down becomes a river of resources that reaches every child, every family, and all human beings. We urge you to use your power to make the needed changes for humanity's survival. But we say that because they have the power to do that. Yeah. Nobody else does, not short of major revolution and total economic environmental collapse. And that would be devastating for all of us. None of us would want to go through that kind of an experience. So it's sort of like go along with the ride. But this book is saying we can't go along with the ride. And the people that are controlling the horses, so to speak, on the wagon need to change paths and reflect on their own activities and their own part of this. And so here's their names. Here's who they are. You guys got to stop doing this now.
And at least remind them of their humanity. Like, how can you? Because you can't live in a castle forever. Sometimes you got to go outside. You're gonna have to go. One time you're gonna have to go to the store. Even if you have a bunch of servants, you're gonna have to get out of your little castle at some point. Peter Phillips, I want to thank you so very much for joining us and for writing this incredible book. It is very needed, and I just appreciate all the work that you do. Again, it's called Giants: The Global Power Elite by Peter Phillips. Peter Phillips has been my guest. He has been he's the former director of Project Censored and also of Media Freedom Foundation, and also he is the professor of political sociology at Sonoma State University. Peter, do you have a website that you'd like to throw out to people?
Well, the book is now available for pre-order at projectcensored.org. It's easy to find there. Just put in Giants, but it should be in bookstores everywhere in the country within the next couple weeks. The official release date is August 21st, but you'll start to see it showing up in bookstores everywhere. But you can pre-order copies now through projectcensored.org.
So the web address is projectcensored.org. And of course, you can look at it at your bookstores, and it's going to be on Amazon, on Jeff Bezos's place. Yes?
It's on all of those places.
All those places. Hey, it reaches people.
No, I agree. But I sort of like the idea that independent booksellers are going to have it and that kind of stuff.
Yes, yes.
It's distributed by Penguin Random House, so it can reach everywhere.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Again, Peter Phillips, thank you so very much for being with us today. I just so appreciate all the work you've done over the many decades. Thank you.
Well, Christine, it was great to be on with you. Thank you very much.
And I want to thank you, listeners, for tuning in. I want to remind you the YouTube video of this conversation is super easy to share. I encourage you to get it. You can share it on your social media, in emails, and that way your family and friends can hear this important conversation. And until next week, I want to remind you to always think outside of the box. Bye for now.